Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Griggs, and I'm host of the Regenaissance Podcast. And today, alongside me, I have Jeff Murray of Murphy Generations Farm. Thank you for joining.
Yes, thank you.
Right, as you're about to take a drink, that's funny. But to get started,
Sorry.
no, that was just funny timing. To get started, I would just love to hear about the history of your farm first, because even I've been following you on Twitter for some time, but even just going to your About Us page, it sounds like there's just an interesting historical aspect of your farm.
Yeah. So I'll tell you first kind of where we're located and what we do. We're located here just west of Girard, Kansas, on a farm that's been in, or farms that have been in our family for a long time. Many of them, some of them go back to the 1800s here, back to my great great grandfather who homesteaded 160 acres. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of history here. Honestly, I wish I knew it better than I do, and I probably should talk more to my grandmother. My grandmother's 95 years old and grew up on a farm, on one of our farms that we still farm in a small farmhouse, and I can talk about some of her stories from that time. I guess. I mean, she would have grown up on a 80-acre farm, and had hogs and a little bit of grain and some cattle, and they would go into town, as I understand it, once a week and sell their eggs um, and go to Kansas City to sell hogs, I think once a year, and then raise most of their own food on a garden and eat their own, meat from their own hogs and those types of things. And she'd walk to a one room school, about a half mile away, um, on a kind of corner. We're in 4 square miles here, so at the intersection, every 2 miles or so. Again, before my time, but I'm told there were one room schoolhouses and a lot of churches on those corners. So she would walk to a one room schoolhouse, as a girl, and maybe have, from what I understand, maybe 20 kids there of all varied ages, and you'd have one teacher that would teach them together. And they would do things like, the big thing that they talk about is harvest time, where they would bring in a grain thrashing machine with a steam engine, and all the men, I guess, would work on cutting down that wheat, putting it into shocks, and then taking it to the thrashing machine together on a wagon, horse-drawn wagon. And then they would have grain that they would put in these granaries, which we still have. We still have a couple different wooden granary buildings where they would store that grain, and then at some point it would be sold. Um, and yeah, what else happened there? Oh, well, the other thing, I mean, you just think about the community aspect of that. So they're all working together. You'd have all the families kind of in that school area, within a couple miles of this school, basically worked as a team to harvest together. And if someone had needs, needed help with something, they would help each other. They all knew each other, went to the same church, same school, had meals together at that, there at harvest. It sounded like it was a big time of, she said they would eat at different people's farms, and the women would compete to see who could cook the best meal. So that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
So stuff like that. And then just the pace of life, she talks about, so her grandfather would have lived on another farm, the farm I've talked about that was homesteaded in the 1800s. He lived about a half mile away, which she said she liked walking over to her grandfather's house and sitting on their porch and playing Chinese checkers and eating whatever they're cooking. They're cooking on a wood stove, their own food from their own garden. They raised all sorts of potatoes and they had their own hogs and cattle, and so those types of things. I mean, it was just such a wonderful way of life, that they had that community. There was no technology, they're not being distracted by cell phones
Yeah.
and TVs and computers. And so it was conversation and good food and helping each other, and community that you actually cared about. You looked at them in the face, and you knew them, and um, yeah, things like that. Now, before my time, again, I'm talking about things that I'm being told. I
Yeah.
didn't get to experience that. I'm only 42 years old, but boy, I think about that, and I think about just contrasting that with agriculture today. What was so wrong with that? Why did we change that? Because it sounds wonderful to me. I don't. I,
Well,
the more I think about the way we do things today, I think, why aren't we doing that? That
yeah.
sounds great.
Well, I'm curious then for did you grow up was your father a farmer then whenever you were growing up?
Um, yeah, and your video is getting a little pixelated. I guess it's okay, but my dad. So yeah, then going into through my you know through the generations there. If you move on from my grandparents into my dad, so my grandfather would have. He actually worked as a welder. Went through World War II. He welded during World War II over in the Pacific. And then but he also grew up on a farm. Both my grandmother and my grandfather, on my dad's side, grew up on farms right here next to us, and some of them we still farm.
Hmm.
And had a big family, and so my grandfather ended up after World War II buying a farm and farming and also welding. So that's what he did. He welded his whole life, in a small welding shop. Well, not small, a small manufacturing facility welding airplanes. And then at night, he would come home and he would raise crops and hogs and cattle. And slowly over time, they were pretty wise with their money, bought farms. And my grandfather bought farms. And then my dad came in kind of in the 80s, and he was kind of similar because, you know, kind of a similar story. There wasn't really enough land, at least he didn't think, for him to farm. He wanted to farm. So what he did is he got a degree in business administration, worked in a hospital, and then farmed at night, in the 80s and into the 90s a little bit. And until he felt like he was able to rent enough land, and that he could farm full time. And he did that in the 90s. My mom also had a full time job, with the extension, Kansas State Extension, teaching nutrition, which is interesting. And that I think really helped my dad because he was able, that job kind of paid our bills. And then he was able to farm and kind of put that money, that any most of the profits from the farm, back into buying farms and buying equipment. And so then that brings us into the 2000s. I graduated high school in 2001. I liked farming, helped my dad. I liked the farm, and did that all throughout. We had cattle, still have cattle. I'm doing that, and crops. That's what we did. Dad was pretty successful, and we were able to kind of continue to grow. I helped him a lot at night, and when I was off of school, all through college. Uh, but kind of a similar story, my mom kind of guided me, but I think both my mom and dad, kind of an unsaid thing was, well, there's not really enough income for you to come be on this farm. So I kind of got guided towards engineering. I really like math, physics, that type of stuff. And so I ended up getting a degree from Kansas State University in agricultural engineering, with ended up being a focus more on the civil engineering side, which what that ended up being was basically helping feedlots and dairies and these big facilities with their lagoons for manure, and the plans on how to spread that manure, and some of the structural design and the hydrologic design, and a lot of different aspects there of those facilities. Right after college, I worked in a small firm that's actually not very far from here, and did that for 7 years. And I worked on projects all over the Midwest. I even worked on a dairy project in China. I've worked on project in Morocco with a dairy. So we even got to do some things overseas with that.
Dang. So I
So
guess
it's interesting. I mean, being in regenerative agriculture, I've seen both sides. I've been, I've been in
yeah.
all sides of agriculture in America. So,
I think before
um,
Jeff
yeah.
before
So
before
that's kind of my story, I guess.
yeah.
Long
No,
story.
that's great. And before talking about that, what you just talked about, working with the dairy and the lagoons, and because that sounds really interesting. My
Yeah.
question with your childhood, and then
Hmm.
pairing that with what you're describing for your grandmother's childhood experience.
Hmm.
So, did was the high school you went to large, or what was that like for your upbringing on that farm?
Mm. High school, small town here in Girard, Kansas, about 2,000 people, and the high school had, I think I had about 100 people in my graduating class. So small high school, but not, incredibly small. There's smaller ones. And had the FFA, Future Farmers of America program within the school, and I was involved with that, and ended up being president of that, and also did at 4-H, if you've heard of that, which is a program for younger kids and high school kids where you take livestock and show them at a fair, and sell them at a sale. I did that with cattle,
Yeah, I guess I've
and other
never
things. So,
for the 4-H. I've never actually really talked about that on this podcast. So I would love to
hmm
hear more on that too. So you're
hmm
saying that it's to show animals and whatnot. Is this another way to bring just kids out too? Because I remember going to one as a kid and just having memories of seeing pigs and whatnot. But outside of that, I don't remember much. So I would just love to hear, yeah, what exactly is the 4-H fairs? Because I know that can be pretty big.
mm-hmm. Yeah, 4-H. Um, 4-H is a government funded program. So you have Kansas State Extension that is paid to educate about agriculture, and one of the aspects of that is 4-H. And so you have these 4-H clubs with kids, kind of school age kids, first grade to high school is kind of the age, like 18, and you can do projects. There's a lot of different projects you can do, and not just livestock. You can do things with forestry, which I did. You can, collect leaves, and you have a book of leaves that they grade you on how you identified these leaves. Sewing, cooking, um, arts and crafts. There's all sorts of aspects of it, but there's also livestock, and the livestock for 4-H is mostly it's focused on feeding an animal and then bringing it to the fair during the summer when that animal is ready to be butchered. And you're going to it with cattle and sheep, you're going to lead it around in a pen, and there will be a judge that will decide, rank these animals, and also rank you on how you're showing the animal, and decide who has the best animal. And or there's two aspects. One is how you show it, and one is the animal. So they'll grade you on both, and then you can win, at either one. And then that animal will be, either pinned up or tied up for about a week, and then you'll have people from the area that'll come out and look at the animals. And then at the end of the fair, you can sell the animals, and there are usually businesses from the community that kind of want to make a donation, so they pay quite a bit of money for those animals to help out that 4-H, or almost as kind of a scholarship, or we're just going to give you some extra money for your animal because we want to help young people in our community. Now, as far as I was just talking about this, my struggle with that, our kids have done that, but my struggle with it is it doesn't align with regenerative agriculture at all, especially on the cattle side. So, to tie up a cow, or steer that you're finishing to butcher, and just feed it grain and haul straw in for bedding and shovel out manure, is totally the opposite of the things I'm trying to do with my cattle and my land. So,
Yeah.
and the other aspect of it is it gets real competitive. And what you get into is people, some of these shows can be big. They can be a lot bigger than a local 4-H show. They'll be national shows. And so you get people that are buying really expensive animals that they've been bred to be the top, to look the best to the judge anyway. And sorry. So yeah, you can get really expensive animals, and I'm not sure we're teaching our kids the right things, with that. So
Yeah, that's interesting because that's one part of agriculture that I still don't really fully get the whole rodeo culture either. I mean, I know there's deep.
rodeo, yeah,
I know there's a deep history of it, and I went to Texas. I mean, I've lived in Texas for some time, and I went to one, and I still from because the stuff that you're talking about, I agree with wholeheartedly. Because I mean, I was vegan for a reason. It's not like I did that for facade. I truly did care about the animals, and that's why I really don't go to
right, right,
zoos at all. Or because going to a
yeah.
zoo and taking a class at one was actually the first, I guess, step that led me to be vegan in the first place. Was just seeing,
I could see that, yeah.
and so that's just the interesting part of the farming western rural aspect of our culture too is the rodeos and these 4-H fairs with the animals because I have my qualms too with just them being cooped up for our entertainment purposes essentially.
Yeah, man, and you talk about the welfare aspect of it. One of the things that's really opened my eyes is talking to my butcher. Actually, he says like because we're talking about livers, livers and kidneys and things, and he says when he sees an animal that's been grain fed and it's real fat, the liver is has abscesses and is terrible. So that
Yep.
tells you the animal's very unhealthy. But he's telling me that my livers for my grass finished animals are fine. They look good. That tells me something. We're abusing these animals. They're just not healthy. It's it's sad that we don't understand that. So
I think that's a good segue into talking on the stuff that you were doing after college with these lagoons and that industry too, because I have
mhm.
not. So were those lagoons with dairies too? Because the ones I've only really looked into are the hog lagoons with Smithfield Foods, and that was just those are nasty.
Mhm. That's what I'm talking about. I was on facilities like that. I got in those lagoons and put equipment in them, so I know
Whoa.
exactly what they are. And I drew up plans for them. I did the soil testing for the clay in them. So yeah, very involved with that. So
So I guess then for the listeners that might not know what this is, can you just help explain what these lagoons are, like the whole process of it, and why they even exist?
mm, what they are. Really, a lagoon is not complicated. I mean, it's a hole in the ground with a compacted layer of clay that you do some soil testing on to kind of verify how fast that uh, manure water is going to seep out through that clay. And there's a certain rate that the state or federal standards have to meet, so that you're not seeping that into groundwater, which actually you are, but you're doing it at a slower rate. So they have a standard on that. So it's all about designing that and sizing that. The number of hogs and how much manure they're producing, or dairy cattle, or whatever it may be, and you size that based on some factors that have been derived, kind of based on the biological activity and the idea that the bacteria will develop in that lagoon to consume a lot of the manure and gas it off, and so there's some sizing factors there. So it ends up being just civil engineering exercise and getting getting the material to the lagoon, having enough space, and then getting it off onto the fields to put those nutrients out.
Whenever you did that, did you ever? I'm curious to hear if any horror stories because when reading about the hog lagoons, how there's times where storms have just kind of destroyed the lagoon and just had it just spread everywhere, or
Mm,
this was a while, a
yeah.
year or two ago, to where then they would be spraying on their fields, but then the wind carried it to other fields and other farms. So yeah, I was just curious to hear if there's any experiences of just like horror stories revolved around these lagoons with these massive dairies.
You know, know that I have a lot of horror stories. I know those lagoons are designed for a certain storage and a certain rainfall event, the 25-year rainfall event, which
Mm,
around here is around 6 inches. So I didn't see a lot of that. I was in the office, and when things like that happen, they don't want anyone out seeing it. They're not calling their engineer to look at it. They want it taken care of and pumped off, and they want that water downstream, and they don't want a big fine for it. So I didn't get to see a lot of that. I saw it when it was more stable, but it's built into the design. It's going to happen. Those things will overflow, and yeah, you're going to have manure running down the stream. So yeah, it just happens. But I didn't get to see a lot of that. No.
then I'm also curious to. Well, I'm just curious to hear your overall experience with all this, especially comparing that to the farming you're doing now. Um,
Mhm.
because how large were these operations that you're working with?
On those operations I was working with, oh, I worked with dairies with 10,000 cows or more, and hog facilities with 50,000 hogs or more. The
Wow.
chicken facilities. One of the chicken facilities had 1 million laying hens. Um, the biggest. I was on the biggest, so I was around them, and then contrasting that with what we're doing today. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that a lot. Um, Gosh, I don't even know where to start. Yeah, it's in so many ways. It's just it doesn't make any sense. I mean, for efficiency or the environment or our health. You can talk about all sorts of aspects of it that it's just wrong morally, and it just doesn't make a sense for efficiency. To me, in my mind, as far as efficiency, because that's what kind of blows my mind, that we in this modern American way in agriculture, not just agriculture, but our whole economy, we have this kind of systematic, I don't know what it is, mechanistic view of how things work, and we think of everything kind of as a factory, and we just analyze that factory and talk about how efficient it is. So I guess with these chickens, we talk about, well, we can just give them this much feed and this much labor. It doesn't take much labor. We've got 100,000 birds in this building. It's all automated, so there's almost no labor. And we can haul all that feed in, and we've gotten them real efficient. They can eat that feed and they can produce this many eggs, and we say that's efficient, right? Well, efficiency, I know this for my engineering, is outputs over inputs. Well, it's all about where you draw that box. So if you draw that box around that chicken building and you figure your outputs and inputs, yeah, it looks real efficient. But if you draw the box around the cornfields that are feeding all those chickens, actually, you need to do that. You've got to draw the box almost around the whole world in our globalized economy, because you've got the cornfield, you've got a farmer that has a tractor, so we've got to go to a tractor factory and factor that in, the fossil fuel and the labor to build that tractor, all the parts. We've got a chemical factory somewhere for all the chemicals we put on this corn and all the labor and the fossil fuel inputs for that. We've got a fertilizer mine somewhere, maybe in Morocco, that where we're mining. We've got labor, we've got fossil fuel there. We've got to ship that across an ocean to put on that corn. We've got to haul all that corn to a grain bin or a grain elevator. You got all the labor and everything involved with that. The trains, the trucks, all of this. If you actually analyze it well, and well, I got to say this too. You got salesmen at every level selling seed and chemicals and fertilizer. So that's labor. We've got people in a USDA office giving us subsidies, so they've got to sit in an office. Their labor's got to be in there. We've got people on the Chicago Board of Trade trading grain. They're they're in this system too, so their labor's in there, their time's in there. But we don't look at that. We just say, "Well, this is so efficient in this chicken barn, or this is so efficient on this cornfield. Look at how many calories we can produce on an acre." That's fine, but you're not looking at the whole system. And then
Yep.
if you look at the output, right? What's our output? What would we like our output to be? Healthy food. Healthy. If this food is junk, it's got toxins in it, it's making us sick, which I believe it is, our output is zero. We're not producing healthy food. It just blows my mind that we can't see that. We're deceived. We're really blind to that. And that's just the efficiency aspect. I mean, we're not, and then you can go into the health. If this food isn't healthy, look at all the healthcare costs of people getting sick and all being in the hospital and all that. There's so many layers to it. Gosh,
No, that's
it's hard to
you.
stay positive sometimes if you think about it too much. You know
No,
what I mean?
definitely.
So,
But you bring up some great points because with the efficiency side of things, I mean, we're seeing this right now with the whole avian flu stuff, to where we've been so
yeah,
efficient to where now it's
yeah,
heavily centralized, and
mhm,
you can take away if this was all forced on us or not. But the fact that whenever you have these barns or the chicken houses with 100,000 chickens, that's just going to be a hotbed for disease. And that's just
yes,
another interesting thing because
yes,
now Brooke Rollins and them are talking about how cheaper eggs now, but that's also because they are importing eggs from Turkey and South Korea and an unnamed
yeah,
third country. Um,
yeah,
and so it's not like
yeah,
they're even bringing new producers, and so that whole aspect is just funny to me too because nuance is never talked. It's just interesting how society as a whole we think black and white for everything. It's always black and
yeah,
white. There's no nuance ever
yeah,
because even with that's why I try to talk on raw milk so much is there's so much nuance with milk that's never talked about. But then all these institutions that we're supposed to trust just sell us these lies like and really misguide us. And to me that's by design as well.
yeah. And then
But
so the other side of it is contrasting that mechanized system with more regenerative system where you focus on especially grazing and having lots of grazing. Um, to me, if you really think about it, I don't know what can be much more efficient than a cow out there grazing, especially a perennial. That if we're doing it in a regenerative manner and we're using maybe no fertilizer or very little fertilizer, I'm not sure what can be more efficient than that because we have almost zero inputs. We're not using the fertilizer, we're not using the chemicals, we're not using much labor really. That cow, we're not hauling manure, we don't have the grain bins, we don't have the tractors. That cow is using her legs to go get free energy that's come free from the sun, eating it and making a really nutrient dense, healthy food for us. So our output's good. We've got on that efficiency output over input, great output. We've got a really healthy product. Inputs are almost zero. That's efficiency, baby. I mean, that's what we have is not efficiency, with these mechanized systems. So,
well, and then also too with the healthcare aspect that you were mentioning too. I mean,
yeah.
on the topic of just like SNAP and how
Mm-hmm.
this is where the media and these institutions are really good salesmen that
Mm-hmm.
they purposely deflect and like for example with the whole soda and how literal soda lobbyists were at these meetings to try to keep well it's from the American Heart Association too, which is just hilarious, of trying to keep soda and other unhealthy items on SNAP benefits, saying that they deserve the freedom. Why strip away? But then they purposely leave out the fact that you can't buy hot and ready food such as a rotisserie chicken on SNAP benefits. So whenever pointing something like that, to me, obviously, it's not about freedom of choice. It's about them having control and power and getting the money because then you learn that 40% of all SNAP purchases come from sugary drinks. That I think it was like 20% of Coca Cola revenue comes from SNAP purchases. And so
Yeah.
obviously that's not about the health of people at all. But then another aspect that's not talked about is this is funded by our tax dollars. which
Mhm.
also these unhealthy benefits, all of those are what lead to all of the chronic diseases that we face in America. And so not only are we paying for SNAP, then you're paying for all of the future healthcare costs that are exorbitant because a lot of these people are
Right.
very unhealthy. And so it's
Yeah.
just running in massive loop. But the government is so
Yeah.
good at selling that to where people might see that and think that they're just stripping freedoms away, and that's just why.
Yeah, and the
Oh,
people,
yeah.
the people are happy too. I mean, when we they're not happy, but they think they're happy. When we print money and give out all these programs, I mean, that gets politicians reelected. The people asked for that, and so they get what they ask for. We get what we ask for. We ask for all this free money, and it's not free. There's all those costs that we just don't see. We're deceived. You know.
So I think then comparing that to your operation now, because I'm curious then, well, I guess when did you decide that you wanted to farm, long term? Was
Mm.
that because you said that you
Okay. Yeah.
liked
Then going
farming?
into
I was just gonna say because you said you enjoyed, farming growing up in high school and all that. Did you see yourself farming then long term?
Yeah, I think I always had that as a goal. So yeah, I went into engineering and was doing that and working on the farm and had some well, ended up getting some cows and trying to kind of do some things on the side, with along with what my dad was doing at a smaller scale. And but at that time I didn't, I mean, that would have been like late 2000s. I didn't know anything about regenerative agriculture. I kind of liked no-till. I learned about that, and we were doing some no-till, but we weren't using any cover crops and doing the grazing and so anyways, yeah, I was working as an engineer, and uh, there was the main thing I didn't like about what I was doing was I really wanted to get back outside and on the farm more. I just had that as a goal, and sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, I don't mind doing that for a couple hours, but all day long, man, it's a drag. I did not like it. I wanted out of there. So I quit, actually quit and went into the Army National Guard and went in and did that because I really thought the health insurance aspect was needed. And then my dad was asking me to do more on the farm. So basically, I went to work for my dad as a part time, kind of a part time, pretty much full time worker on the farm, and did the National Guard and did that starting in 2012. And then about 2019, I believe, my dad has a lot of health issues, and his health issues started getting worse. And basically, I was asked, "Would you?" By my mother and my dad, "Would you take this over because it's just too much? We want to retire. We want you to take this." And honestly, we have about 1,000 acres of crops. We have about 500 acres of pasture. Okay, so I was struggling with it even then because I was tremendously blessed. I mean, there's very few people in the world that have that opportunity
Because
that
that's actually
they
what's
would just be given.
yeah.
Just here. Do you want to take this? Do you want to do this? That want to farm because there's so many people that want to do that, and I hesitated because I had gone through Dave Ramsey's classes on not having debt. And I knew to do that, to farm 1,000 acres, now, I mean, it's going to take for us in our area $300 or $400 an acre on some, on corn probably, just to put in the crop. If you do it in a conventional way with the seed, the chemicals, the fertilizer, factor in your equipment, crop insurance. So in other words, like what they're asking me is, okay, do you want to do this? But you're going to have to borrow 200,000, 300,000 to do this because I don't have that sitting in the bank to just go out and plant these crops. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I was hesitating. I'm like, yes, I want to do it, but I don't like the debt. Basically, was my thought. And okay, and then right around that same time, my we had our youngest child, my son Asher. who is 6 now. It's right around the same time. I don't know the timeline exactly, but right around the same time we had him. He has Down syndrome. Okay. One of the things that when we had him, one of the things I was looking at is what causes Down syndrome. What's going on here? When you have a child, it gets emotional thinking about that and what's going on. And one of the things that was popping up as I was reading things is chemicals. And the wild thing to think about too with our kids is it could have been a chemical that was used by my grandfather that is passed through and modified genetics somehow and passed through the line. So that's scary when you think about that. When you think generations behind us,
Yep.
what effects are we having with what we're doing right now on generations behind us? So, anyways, that's one of the factors of why I'm doing regenerative agriculture because I want to get away from these chemicals. Honestly, I'm not yet, but I'd like to get completely away from them. And along with that, I started reading a lot of things, watching lots of YouTube with Gabe Brown, whole group of them, Dave Brandt, Rick Clark, all sorts. There's amazing resources out there. So I started getting into that, yeah, as
How
a
how
way
long
to reduce cost, reduce chemicals, and it just seems like just such a better way. And then then I decided to go ahead. Let's go ahead. Let's go in debt and take over this farm. And I've been doing that for about 4 years now, and really trying to focus on regenerative agricultural principles.
That was gonna be my
But
question was it
yeah,
was 4 years ago whenever you were starting to do all the research with
it
Gabe
would have
Brown
been,
and them?
yeah, right around 2020 is when I really kind of jumped into things with cover crops and more grazing and things like that. Yeah.
And that's also interesting too on the topic with your father asking you to take over because that's one thing that's
Mhm.
um, can be very messy in agriculture. I've I
Mhm.
was reading on Twitter and it was actually really disheartening. And I felt so bad for Gen X, how it was saying that a lot of Gen X has pretty much been passed over with a lot of their farms from their families because they had been holding on to that rather than giving it up and just helping guide their children as they're taking it over to where then now it's being
Mhm.
passed over to the next generation. And I've heard just so many horror stories as well of just whenever it's handed over. Yeah, that's just not that's something that's not talked about to where the consumer side of to where everyone that's not in agriculture really do not realize that type of aspect of agriculture is it's there's a lot of problems right now to where there's not an heir and a lot of the farmland could be potentially bought up by really big players such as BlackRock. But then on another problem is the fact that the ones that do have an heir, it can get very messy and um, yeah. So that's interesting to hear your experience from that too, because then you have the interesting opportunity and the fact that your father's giving that to you, but then also hearing having to take on debt is also very challenging in itself. And this is just a good
Yeah.
showcase of just the complexity of agriculture
Yeah.
and trying
And
to
there's
make this work.
there's so many different situations, and to me, it's all about relationships, and trust within your family. And I think a lot of it, gosh, a lot of it has to do, I think, with our spiritual state and how we see ourselves, how we see the land. I mean, being a follower of Jesus, we've got to see ourselves, we've got to see abundance, we've got to see ourselves as stewards. We can't just say, I'm going to keep everything to myself. I got to take care of myself. You've got to be generous with that next generation and let go of things. And it can be over stages. I mean, you can give them part of the farm and let them do that, for a while and learn. And that's those are the types of things that need to happen that don't happen. And they need to happen early. They need to happen when those kids are young. Give them some ownership in something, so that they can learn. Because that's the fear, is that, well, I'm just going to give it to them and they're going to go bankrupt and lose everything. Well, that's on you. You should have trained them up. You should have been training them up when they were younger. Like my son works for me on the farm. We pay him. I'm asking for his advice on things. How do you want to do this? He's 16. What do you think? And he loves it. I mean, he loves giving me his opinion. I don't do exactly what he's asked, but I'll experiment with things.
Yeah.
You've got to do that. And yeah, I think it's about our spiritual state. And I will give my family a lot of credit because they were pretty good at that. I mean, as far as my dad let me make some choices like that. So,
And I love I've seen you talk about it on Twitter quite a bit too. Is whenever you're farming and thinking about the health of the land and the food, is you're also thinking about your children and then your future grandchildren too, and that's something that's
yeah.
very important. Is what agriculture forces you to think long term, and in a society to where going to like the max efficiency, and we just expect everything to be handed to us or completed or getting the result as quickly as possible. Farming is not like that at all, and I really like whenever hearing other farmers talk about that, thinking about the future generations because that's how it should be.
Yeah, and that's gosh, when I think about it and pray about it and my goals for this farm with everything I'm learning, I have learned and am learning, um, my goals for this farm are to get more people on the land, really, ultimately. And I would love for it to be my family. Like I would love to see my kids each have, a homestead on our land, whether they work the land or not. I just like for them to be on the land. I would love for them to, have probably have an enterprise within our operation. So whether it be one maybe can focus on marketing, one could focus on the hog operation, one could focus on a chicken operation. There's so many things you can do, which again, back to efficiency. I mean, we should be able to stack on 1,500 acres. We could stack all sorts of those things on there, but we need labor. I mean, we've got to have more people again on the land. And even if it's not my kids, if I can hire some people or gosh, I think 1,500 acres is way too much. I mean, if we could even rent out some of it to somebody to do some different operations, and just kind of all help each other and work together and market together. Um, that's what I envision for this land. Whereas, and that's not how you're taught to think. That's not how we're taught to think in agriculture or in our economy. We're taught to think buy more land, get bigger and bigger,
Yeah.
get corporate, get bigger and bigger and bigger. We're not taught to think get smaller. So,
So with the crop side of things too, because this is a topic that's always discussed and needs to be discussed with regenerative agriculture and if it can even be viable for the future. With the 1,000 acres of crops, do you believe
mhm.
that doing that regeneratively, like that's feasible long term?
Yes. Yes, I actually think we need less cropland. I want to do more grazing and I am, but I'm kind of working into that. Again with that generational aspect. So I've got my grandmother and my dad own land. And so I'm sharecropping land. And so it's a big change for them when I do grazing instead of crops. They're used to crop income coming in. So I'm working through that, slowly changing over. But yeah, more what I envision for the future and where I'm working towards is probably maybe a rotation like 1 in 3 years we will just graze that land. So I'll only have 700 acres of crops. In other words, and they're really kind of reducing the amount of crop area that we're doing and doing more grazing because the grazing is what really stimulates that biology, the microbes, the
Hmm.
the fungi, and cycles those nutrients right back rather than them leaving our farm. So yeah, but do I think it's feasible? I do. I don't think it's easy. I think especially getting away from chemicals is not easy. Our soils have been, I would say, our soils are addicted to chemicals and have been abused. And so it's the analogy that I've heard is it's almost like a drug addict. You don't with a drug addict, sometimes you don't go cold turkey because they may go into shock. Literally, if they don't have a little bit of alcohol or a little bit of that drug, they will go into shock and die. And I think our soils are similar. We've got to kind of slowly reduce, and we've got to get that soil healthy enough that hopefully we don't have these weed flushes. I mean, if you're especially on the crop side, weeds are real, and it's hard to grow crops when the field's covered in weeds. And I don't like tillage, so it's a challenge figuring out how are we going to control weeds. I know we say we can suffocate them with our cover crops, and I've seen that work, but it's hit and miss. I've seen it work at times, other times not. So those are some
Yep.
of the challenges that I'm dealing with.
So with the actual just like the chemical sprays and the whole process of that, because I have not fully talked a whole lot on that as well on this podcast for the listeners, because I know by now consumers understand that a lot of these chemicals that are sprayed are disastrous, but I don't think
Mhm.
the majority of the population understands just like the whole process of how it's actually implemented. So would
Mhm.
just love to hear, yeah, just how are these chemicals used, say like in a year time scale on a farm with a 1,000 acre plus crops to farm.
Mhm.
What's that process like?
Process. Um, well, like on soybeans or corn, it really depends what you're doing and how intensive you're going to be with this. But typically with corn or soybeans, you're going to put down probably three, maybe four different chemicals in a mix that's going to be sprayed with a large sprayer. Um, Typically right around planting time, and they're going to spray. Either the farmer's going to do it, or you're going to hire someone to do it with a company. A lot of it I have hired. I don't. I've done some myself, but a lot of it I have hired, and we're going to spray 20 gallons, 15, 20 gallons of water per acre out of a big sprayer with maybe 60 to 100-foot wide booms, and it's just going to be sprayed down onto the ground to either kill anything that's out there or suppress any weeds that are coming. And then most people have genetically modified corn or soybeans that have been genetically modified, so they're not affected by these herbicides, and then they sprout and grow up. And then usually you'll do at least one more spray, if not two, on that crop with a mix of 2 to 4 different chemicals. Again, when the crop is growing, 20 gallons per acre spraying over the top of it. And some people do a lot more than that. We can do fungicides, insecticides, yeah, things like that. I'm very minimal on. I haven't used a fungicide or insecticide in I don't know, several years. So yeah, but some people do a lot. They may do multiple fungicide passes, so they'll be spraying a fungicide over the top too. So,
Yeah, I've talked with a farmer that very messy situation of a neighboring farmer using chemical sprays and the wind carrying it to their farm, and
mhm.
that in itself is also disastrous. I would,
Yeah.
because then, without just going crazy into detail, but the people that he was supposed to go to and help out with him are captured essentially by these chemical companies, and so they're fully embedded, and there's really nothing that he can really do at the moment fully to push back. And that's also just another aspect of all of this, is the fact with the chemical companies, the big ones, and how powerful they are and how powerless a farmer can be, because again the chemical companies have all the money they can just use for lawyers essentially. And I mean, you even put a good saying you had to go 200 to 300K in debt to take over your farm, so that's a very major
Yeah,
challenge
that's
in
the thing.
itself.
There's no. So most farmers aren't even thinking about the chemical concern. They probably do in the back of their mind, don't like it, and they have a concern about it, but they won't even talk about that. So they're not even to that point. But even if they wanted to get away from it, If you're, I'm pretty small. 1,000 acres is pretty small. I mean, there's people with 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 acres. You know, there's no easy path out of it. There's no, like, a guy can't just go cold turkey and decide I don't like chemicals and quit, because he will then go broke. With he'll have all sorts of weeds and lose money, and especially at something that scale, I mean, you're just going to go bankrupt. So that there is not an easy path out of this, and
No.
that's what I think, that is one of the main disconnects with the people that are in a city that don't know
Yes.
anything about farming. Is they think, well, why are we doing this? Why are the farmers even doing this? Well, there's multiple things going on there, and one is there's no easy path out. There's no
No.
The government's not passing out money so that, because to help you with your reduced crop yields if you try to get out of this. And even if we do, and then you've got the tillage aspect. If your solution is tillage can be horrible. I mean, I have fields around me. We'll look at my fields where I have those cover crops and it's green and we've got it all covered, and there'll be some water running off the field, but it's crystal clear. I mean, I can look in a glass and just see right through the water coming off my fields. These tilled fields around me, you take a glass of that water and it's chocolate milk with soil, and there's ditches in those fields. So if that is not, just tilling everything is not a solution to get away from chemicals. It's not a good solution. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the massive disconnect is on the money because I see this
Yeah.
all the time, and I try to talk on this a lot from just for regenesis is the fact that the consumers don't understand it at all. They really don't, and
Yeah. I
it's
don't blame them. I mean, they're disconnected from the land. Again, we need more people on the land. They've got to be closer to it. So, yeah.
because of the same thing with just this whole Maha movement, which is great, but they're trying to make all of these demands for restaurants to start doing regenerative, grass-fed, and finished XYZ, all of the premiums, but they fail to understand that they hold zero risk at all. They don't have any risk on their end. The 100% of the risk is the business. Because if they make these changes, say they fork over all this money, they do all this kind of training, and they make these small changes, and then it could work or it couldn't. But then also say another company that I'm trying to make a good analogy here, but say another company had massive funding and then they were able to start right off the gate, then all these consumers are just going to switch. They have no allegiance really. Their allegiance is how much money they personally have, and if it's the cost of the goods that they buy essentially. Because I see this with apparel to where whenever I first started my brand, I was going to assume that having American made apparel was going to be good and the consumers really wanted that because American made, but then
Yeah.
that was not the case at all because I would just get complaints about how expensive my shorts were or XYZ.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
realized, oh, they don't really care about that. They really care about how much money they're spending essentially. And
Right.
so when thinking about agriculture with the cost of everything, it goes with a disconnect, but they have no skin in the game at all. And so they hold zero risk of it all. They have no understanding of the fact that these farms, they've been doing that their whole lives. It's been passed down for however many generations. Um, it's from like a stress standpoint. I've talked about this a lot on other podcasts. The fact that suicide rates are worse for farmers than is veterans. And again, there's these massive trade-offs that you have to make because it's already a very capital intensive operation, especially doing it the conventional model that we've been doing it for so long. The consumers don't have any understanding of that at all. And so it's just really frustrating whenever they make all these demands. Because I kind of mentioned that before our podcast a little bit, that they really need to take a big piece of humble pie and take a step back and actually listen to the farmers and ranchers and try to understand where they're coming at. Because it's not like they're intentionally wanting to poison the food and make you sick. It makes no sense from
You're
from a
right.
farmer's standpoint.
Yeah. It just ultimately, I think the answer is local. Local. Shake the hand that feeds you. It's local. It's local economy and local food. That's the answer. How do we get there? I don't know. You know, if you education, I mean, we've got to educate people on both sides, and then people have to actually take action. So that, I mean, if you're in a city, to me, if you're in a city, the best thing you can do is go meet a farmer and buy local food somehow. I mean, as much as possible, because that will stimulate more farmers to move that direction. And once you get local, see, that's the interesting thing about local versus corporate and globalized economy. You know, just anything like anything you produce locally, you actually know the person that's doing it, and you actually know how they're treating their workers, you know how they're treating their land. You know what I mean? So,
Yep.
like, if there's a guy out here that is just spraying chemicals all over the neighbor's property, doing things like that, and you know, even if they've gotten away from chemicals, or they're abusing their workers, you know, they're not paying their workers very good, their soil's washing off their field, stuff like that. Basically, if it's local economy, people are going to know and they're going to say, I'm not buying anything from that guy. I don't like him, you know, and stuff like that. But when it's a corporate economy, we don't even see that stuff. It's we're totally disconnected from it. It's over heck, the stuff being produced overseas. We have no idea how it's been produced.
Yeah.
So that's the solution. Now, how we get there, I it's hard. And I think there's, like I said, I think there's a spiritual aspect to it on all sides. I mean, we've got to see ourselves as stewards. We've got to let go of the selfishness. We've got to um, think of loving our neighbor. You know, think of water and food as if I love my neighbor, I want them to have healthy food. If I love my neighbor, I want the water to be clean that people are drinking. We've
Yep.
got to get to that too. You know, so it's
Amen.
almost like a spiritual revival is needed.
Oh, absolutely.
And I could talk about that stuff too all day long. So,
Well, because I'm a perfect example of that. Because I always continue to say that agriculture saved my life because it truly did. I literally watched my brother be tortured alive. I heard him be tortured alive for 6 months through cancer, chemo, all of the opioids, while also taking care of my mom, and then seeing all of that unfold and how it ripped my family apart. But then also seeing everything that's just um, in healthcare and how they're all just set up to fail without realizing it, and then they go through hell. Like I have so much love for all of the healthcare that go in for the right reasons, but they don't realize how much had been failed purposely from a lot of these institutions.
yeah,
But
yep,
then that's also why I always, above all else, I mean, you said it too, is to shake the hand that feeds you because it is literally life changing.
yep, that's it.
I
That's it.
cannot say it otherwise because I will never forget visiting Jordan Hedberg on his ranch and having his beef that he harvested with his farm fresh garden and eggs, and then using the butter from local local, I think it was on his farm too. I think
Hmm.
about that meal all the time because I vividly remember taking the first bite and I dropped my fork thinking, I've never had anything like this from a grocery store in my life, and I was 27 at the time.
Yeah, big
And,
difference. Yeah,
and from there, like it started, the hamster wheel started spinning quick because then I get to see the land and see all of the work that he's doing and see the connections just start coming in my head of, man, this is incredible. And then as I worked on a farm, and then that furthered the whole spirituality thing as well,
yeah,
and so that's why I continue to harp on get your families out to farm or ranch that allows visitors because for kids too, it's incredible for them. Whenever I worked on the farm, seeing the kids how they just loved being out there, helping the farmers markets, it's it's something that's sorely missed, and it's slowly bringing back. And I have a lot of hope in that regard.
yeah.
Um,
I think it'll
yeah,
be. I think you're. Yeah, getting your kids out there is a really good point because honestly, think it may we may go that way because I think these kids, especially with everything they've been through with COVID, with what they're hearing, from Robert Kennedy Jr., with podcasts, with YouTube, these kids are they're going to get it, I think. If
I
we
think so
keep
too.
educating. Now there's a lot more we could do, but these kids are going to get it and they're going to reject a lot of this stuff, I think. So
I
that's good.
wholeheartedly
And
agree
that's
with
key.
that too. Yeah,
Yeah.
and because with that too, being a parent, especially in today's society, is extremely difficult for a lot of reasons. But my biggest issue when I hear parents say that I would do anything and even die for my kids, meanwhile, they won't live for them. By the time their kids have kids, they can barely walk, even though they're probably like in their 60s or 70s. Even before that,
Mm,
having kids, they
mm,
can't even because that's how my family. I'm not. I have no. This is not any shame towards my father. It's just how society was. Like he's had a really bad back and knees for a lot of my life, and so
yeah.
just I would think about this stuff a lot. So that's also another aspect to where I think if a family goes to a farm, they see that whole connection and think about those things a lot and truly think
Hmm.
about the health of themselves for their family and for their children and for their children's children. I it's a very slow burner because this has been an ongoing generational problem for a long time in America and the world, and it's not going to be reversed or changed overnight. But it's definitely slowly course correcting, and I do have a lot of hope that the younger generations will see that, and then they can also help influence their parents as well. So
Yeah.
that
One
keeps
of
me
this.
really optimistic.
Yeah. Well, what, and I'm not being optimistic here, but I think we can do it. But one of the saddest things I think is, our school food being just this industrial cheapest food we can get, soy burgers. Gosh, and I want to work on that, but and I'd like in our local school, and I think I'm going to at some point. But um, man, there's only so many things you can work on at once. I would love to get some local good food. Now, the big challenge is I can't compete on price with a soy burger. You know what I mean? My beef's going to be twice or three times the cost. And of course, the school's going to say, well, we don't have any budget, for more meat, for a higher price for our food. And it's just like, really, if we understood the nutrition and what we were doing to our kids, you would think we would be trying to get them better food. Also, the military does the same thing. The military's food is horrible, and you think about, we say we love our troops and we love, we care about our military and we feed them the worst, cheapest food we can get. Sad.
With because I saw Brooke Rollins, I still have not heard any updates really or a new plan. They canceled the $10 billion for the schools with the food, and
Did they? Oh, wow.
I was trying to dig into more on that. I couldn't really find much of why they did that. Was the money not being used properly? Because that was my assumption if they were doing that to where a lot of the money was just funneled and not actually used to help schools get good quality
Yeah,
local food. I didn't know
could
if you
be.
saw any of that. That's what I was gonna ask.
Well, see, Brooke Rollins can't say any of the things I'm saying. I mean, she starts saying stuff like that, about the food not being healthy. She's going to have these huge, whatever, lobbyist groups all over her, these corporations all over her. You can't say that, so I don't know. It's, it's,
Yeah.
it's a mess.
I want to transition a little bit to on the topic of wheat as a whole.
Okay.
Because I also mentioned just or in flour too that before this podcast, I had Oatman Grass on my podcast, and he's the only one that has really done wheat, and so I just wanted to talk on that too, of the grains that you grow for all of that. How do you go about wanting to do like you grow a heritage wheat, turkey red hard wheat?
Hmm.
Was that because I guess how did you go about all of that and wanting to grow that specifically too? Because again, I have not talked to many farmers that do this, and this is just a cool aspect of agriculture too. Is you have a piece of land and you can figure out to do it in so many different ways.
Hmm. Yeah. So the wheat, yeah, we've always grown wheat, but just getting into regenerative agriculture and like we've been talking local food. Um, a couple years ago, I really wanted to kind of drove me to try doing an old wheat called Turkey Red wheat, which is a heritage wheat that goes back into, I believe, the early 1900s. Might have been the wheat, I don't know. Might have been the wheat that was being grown on this farm 100 years ago. Probably was, because it was the prevalent wheat in Kansas and most of the Midwest, in the early 1900s. So I got a few bags of it and planted it and liked doing that. The thing about the older wheats are they're taller and they don't stand up well if you heavily fertilize them. So it's a real good. It's almost a good way to force limit yourself from using too much fertilizer, and to reduce those inputs, because it'll fall down and it'll be really hard to harvest if you over fertilize it. So it's also not as high yielding. So the people in this area, can get, if you're heavily fertilizing, on soft wheats, you can get up to 100 bushels per acre, whereas this Turkey Red might do 30, maybe more like 20. So it's a much lower yielding situation. The beauty of it is these older wheats really work with the soil, so they're not grown and adapted to being fed lots of fertilizer and fungicides and things like that. They are adapted to, I'm going to work with microbes and fungi in the soil to get my nutrients. And then I'm going to put those nutrients in that grain and have a higher protein grain with more nutrients in it, that hasn't had all these chemicals. And that's another aspect of it. Not in this area, but you get much north of here, and my understanding is a lot of times wheat is actually sprayed with Roundup or other chemicals to kill it right before harvest. So when you get flour from the store, you may probably are getting a small dose of whatever chemical they sprayed on that, right before they harvested. So my wheat, I'm not using that Turkey Red. I'm not using any chemicals, period, and a lot of it no fertilizer. I use a touch of fertilizer on some of it, and so I experimented with it. I like doing it, and then probably one of the favorite things that I've done in the last year or two is I've made contact with two different small flour mills, um, both in the Kansas City area. Small guys doing stuff out of a shed on a small farm they own.
Hmm.
They have other jobs. This is just a part-time thing. They mill flour and then they sell it in farmers markets and stuff. So I made contact with them because they wanted my wheat. They were looking for heritage wheats and they made contact with me, become friends with them, and then I'm getting flour from them. So we're not milling the flour. I just give them my wheat. They give me flour back, and then we're selling flour on our website and also in a small store here in our hometown, with that heritage wheat. So that's been fun. Learned a lot, and it makes you feel good. I mean, this man, when you eat bread or you eat like banana bread or cookies or pancakes from this wheat, um, it's just so much more. There's so much more there. You can just tell there's more nutrient. It fills you up. I mean, there's just so much more there, and it feels good. Like you feel good. I think you feel good after you eat it. A lot better than eating the junk that from the stores. And you feel good about. I can eat a cookie made from that and actually feel good about eating a cookie because there's nutrition in it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm just really enjoying doing it now. At the same time, the things you're talking about with the T-shirts being too expensive because they're made in America, I've got that flour priced quite, a lot higher than store flour. So we get that same kind of thing. Well, yeah, we're selling some, but I'd like to sell more. And basically, the challenge is, do people really want to pay that price for flour? So that's the challenge with it.
It's interesting too because it's just a massive problem with all of this. I'm trying to get folks to go on the farm and experience having farm fresh food because it really is that much better and different than most of
Oh,
these
it
grocery
is,
stores.
man, it is.
And
Yeah.
you feel incredible because it's very. I'm trying to. We really have to shift the whole culture of America, but then with farming and the whole economics of it, because also now our whole viewpoint of the price of goods is just completely skewed too, to where we expect. food, healthy food, we expect it to be just insanely cheap, and it needs to be insanely cheap, but don't realize that for most of our existence, uh, what we spend on for food was much, much, much higher than what we spend on for food today.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
if we want to have good food, we're gonna have to be paying more. From it just from an economical sense, for like you're saying, for you to continue what you're doing and potentially expand to grow more wheat, you need to price it at that point, or else you're just gonna go out of
That's right.
business. And
Yeah, and yeah, and marketing is a big challenge. I'm trying to learn marketing right now, and that's a challenge. Like I don't have a marketing degree, and and I'm trying to farm 1,500 acres by myself and then learn marketing on top of it. It's
yeah,
like,
well,
can
and
I do
that's
that? Do I have
yeah,
time for that? That's what I'm trying to do.
and
But I
that's
am kind of
another.
excited about. Yeah,
I
go ahead.
I just wanted to add this point. This is just a great point on what consumers fail to understand too, just how difficult for farming, because that adds on extra costs too. If you were to want to have, say, a marketer or even somebody to do soil testing or carpenter, veterinarian, there's just so many different things that
Hmm.
could be additional cost. Or for a farmer that doesn't have the funds for that, they have to do all that themselves. And so this again goes back to the conversation of consumers asking all these questions about conventional agriculture and why they're doing chemical sprays and all of that. This goes back to the economics and trade-offs of they just have no idea all what goes down for a farm. All they see is Yellowstone TV shows and think that
Hmm. Yeah.
that's what the life out there is like. Um,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very challenging for that.
The thing is, yeah. But one thing I will say, we've been talking a lot about education, and I'm excited. I've got something that I'm working on that I'm excited about. We'll see how it plays out. But I'm trying to get into a farmer's market. I think I am in Kansas City
Hmm.
area, Lenexa. It sounds like I'm going to get in, which is an interesting conversation right there because I'll mention this. It's interesting to me that like I apply for a farmer's market and it's hard to get in. So we say we want local food and more people to do this stuff, but yet we're screening people from getting into a farmer's market, and it's you have to almost know someone to get in. That's an interesting thing to think about. Why is it that way? And I think I understand why they do it, and the mindset behind it is they only want so many people, so many vendors, because they don't want too many there because they won't make enough money, or the money will be split up too many different ways. But I don't know what the solution is, but that's an interesting aspect that I'm learning about. Along with that, I am learning that an opportunity there may be that I can do presentations in these large businesses in the city that have wellness people that are about, nutrition or wellness, healthy people in their companies.
Yeah.
So, an opportunity for education, which I think we should be doing a lot more of, probably, is farmers going and making presentations at these businesses on these workers' lunch hours about their farm, and and then hopefully that leads to some sales. There needs to be a lot more of that type of stuff going on. And I just did that conference 2 days ago, and that was a group of farmers in Kansas State. But marketing I think marketing takes a lot of face time, for people to get across what we're trying to get across about healthy food and reducing chemicals, and it's an emotional connection. So like if I start talking about my son, that I'm concerned about my son and what's happened to him through chemicals, and I get emotional about that, people resonate with that because I was
Absolutely.
talking about that and they tune in
Yep.
when you start talking about that stuff, and then I think you can sell some products.
I mean, this is why I have
So,
my
but it takes
podcast. This is
time. I mean,
this is
yeah,
why I
it
do
takes
all of
time.
that. Is
Yeah,
stories are so powerful
yeah,
for because we're so disconnected. Stories are one is like an entry door essentially to really starting
yeah,
to understand of, oh shit, I have not realized this for my whole. I mean, just like for me, I've not realize what's happened in agriculture my whole life, and then going through my family, but then also now just hearing story after story after story. It's just it opens up your eyes, and uh, it works.
So but if you think about that, look at what I'm asking a farmer to do right there. A farmer who's usually pretty stoic and used to be sitting in their tractor by themselves, you're asking them to make a presentation in front of 100 people or something and get emotional about it. That's a big ask. I mean,
Yep.
but that's what needs to happen. But
But that's
that's hard
also
to do.
but that's also again why I have the brand is there could be people in the I'm not for like middleman for a lot of industries and reasons, but like for agriculture, there there needs to be more people in the middle helping bring people over
Yeah,
and because it is a big ask, and that goes back to farmers only have so much time.
yeah,
There's so many problems in agriculture because of the lack of help and knowledge and awareness. Because again, we have what 330 million Americans, and only 1.5% of that is in all of ag. That is so low.
well, and the interesting thing too is what I'm talking about there. Look, we have people paid with tax money to actually facilitate stuff like that, the education, and they can do it like that. That's what that conference was, but we need to do it. We need to actually facilitate it. Now, some of the challenge is Kansas State, this Kansas State and the government has so much money and influence from these corporations that it's really hard for them to even talk about this stuff
Well,
or support any of it because
that's
if
also
they're
why I say the
supporting
middle.
people that are saying negative things about chemicals in these corporations are going to say, "Hey, I don't like that," and their bosses are going to say, "Don't talk about that because we're going to lose our funding."
Well, that's also why I was saying there needs to be people in the middle that aren't like there needs to be people that are working together with these farmers to speak because like for example
Yes.
I have no issues on this at all. I have no fear of their pushback for any of that because of what I've gone through and just also again going to just everything I'm learning. I want to help as much as possible
Yeah.
because I do get that to where farmers just want to farm too. And I remember talking to a dairy farmer, a raw dairy farmer, and I was wanting to talk to his scientists that do research if they were wanting to come on my podcast, just share that. But they were so fearful of just any backlash that they just want to do the research. And so that was just
Yeah,
like,
man.
oh, there needs to be people to really speak out and not be afraid of these big players because that's also knowledge is power because these institutions have had just so much power because of that. They know that there hasn't been enough pushback from people. They know that there wasn't a lot of stuff being shared on social media, but now that's starting to really happen, and
Yeah.
and they know that too. They definitely know that. I. It's also what kind of gets me hopeful is they're starting to see the pushback and the fact that people are waking up to these things. And it's going to take a
Yeah,
long
I'm sure they
time,
are.
but I do believe that.
Even me, like even doing this podcast, I know my neighbors are going to see this, and I'm already kind of out there. Like, so I share a lot of this stuff on Twitter or X. My neighbors aren't on X. I know that. If I share stuff on Facebook, I mean, you're immediately, I'm the black sheep of the farming community in my area by talking about this stuff. And you make enemies with your neighbors because they don't think anyone should be speaking negatively about how they farm. You know what I mean? So,
And that's another.
yeah, so it's a challenge.
It is because the one thing we cannot do is silo them and because that's another issue that I have with a lot of the growing population that's waking up too though is the fact that then they just pin everything on these farmers, and that is something that we cannot do at all because if we want to drive the change that we want and need as humans, as Americans, and for agriculture, that's literally the last thing that we need to be doing because again going back to the fact that they are not doing this to purposely destroy our health and land. The system is very tough. And the fact
Yeah.
again that this has been passed down for generations, that's what they've been taught from their granddad, their dad, and they've been doing the same work their whole livelihood. And now there may be in their 50s or 60s and now told that not only do they need to change everything that they're doing, they need to take away all of the machines and all of the personal debt and financial investments they've taken, and then add more financial investments to make these changes for the systems to make it regenerative. Like it is a
Yeah,
massive,
and
massive
not only
undertaking.
yeah, and not only have they been taught it by their family, this is the way we farm. Most of the farmers that are pretty successful, they have college degrees from universities. They've been taught this at universities, and they're still being taught by the professionals. They're doing great. No, no change needed. There's the regenerative thing is a minority voice that's out there. Uh, so yeah, yeah, we're up against a lot to change.
My, I'm trying to, because going back then to just with regenerative agriculture, and especially for the crop farmers too, because I know this conversation would then need to be talking about do we have 5,000 acres of crops? Because I'm actually, this would be a question for you then. So you have the 1,000 acres of crops.
Mhm.
What all is it being used for? And yeah, I'll start there.
Okay. Corn and soybeans and milo, um, wheat. And then I saved some cover crop seed, rye, vetch, sunflowers. I'm doing a little bit of sunflowers. I'm really trying to. My goal would be to do less soybeans for sure because I know that they pump a lot of nitrogen in my soil. And I really don't care for soybeans in food. So I don't feel that good about growing them. So I'm trying to reduce that. But again, it's incremental. It's incremental. I'm doing a little bit more sunflowers, a little bit more milo, a little bit more of this old wheat, and trying to grow that. A little bit more grazing each year. Trying to slowly grow that, almost weaning myself off of the commodity system, and trying to develop those markets. Can I develop this market for my wheat for flour? Can I develop a market for milo for gluten-free flour? That's kind of a next challenge I have ahead of me. Can I grow cowpeas for cover crop or for food? But I do it on small acreages. So I'm farming 1,000 acres. I may do 10 acres of cowpeas to try to kind of develop that. And that's where I'm at right now is trying to develop those things, but it's very incremental. I mean, if I just went all out and just said I'm doing 1,000 acres of these diverse crops, but I don't have a market for it, I'll be in a lot of trouble financially. So I really got to manage that.
So with those 10 acres for that, like you're just testing that out, because that's reminds me whenever I was on the farm, they had a couple we'd call sacrifice lots to just
Mhm.
test things out like that.
We've been doing a lot of that. I take a lot of little, which the cool thing about our farms is we have a lot of fields. So I've got a lot of little 5, 10 acre fields, not a lot, but I've got several 5, 10 acre fields. So, and they even doing that is kind of hard. Like I'll take, especially with your family. I mean, I like to take fields that are kind of in the back that no one looks at because I really don't want to hear about it from my dad and my grandma. Why are you doing that? That's not how we do it, and what is that? There's weeds in it, and it's like, I can explain it to you and I've explained it to you before, but you don't really want to hear it. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's how I do it. I mean, I'll do stuff, but I'll do it on small scale, kind of experimenting. I'm doing a lot of that. I want to experiment with some pumpkins in a mix on a field, stuff like that, sweet corn, all sorts of stuff. I love playing with that, but again, you've got to limit your risk. I mean, if I go all out, I could be in trouble. So,
My final question I have then to close this awesome conversation, what is, it's kind of a broad question, but what is your favorite aspect of just agriculture, especially
mm,
essentially being a part of it your whole life?
okay, what favorite aspect?
Or it could just be like what's your most cherished memory, or one of your most cherished memories of agriculture too?
Yeah, I don't know. You're gonna get me emotional. I might start crying. No, it's probably family. I mean, I think my favorite times on the farm is when, you're working with your family, your dad and your grandpa and your son
Yeah.
and a lot of that really either at harvest time, we kind of work together, but it's not, you're all on different pieces of equipment, but there's been a lot of fun times with that and then taking care of cattle in the winter, doing that together. So,
Hmm. No, I love that because that is, I mean, that's literally my north star is thinking about having a future family on my future ranch. Because
that's awesome. It's good.
um, yeah, obviously the last 5 years have been hell, and so that has, thinking about that definitely, and then hearing like your stories and just others too, it always is very heartwarming, and yeah, it just continues to allow me to want to do this stuff because yeah, uh, seeing the family whenever I worked on the farm, and then I went back last year after a couple years, and just hearing their updates and seeing the kids 2 years later, it is so awesome to just hear them and just watch them just enjoy the life that I really want for my future family.
Hmm. Agreed. Agreed.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. This was awesome. I guess with the closing,
Mhm.
if there's any things that you would like to share or plug, this would be the good time to do that.
Yeah, if you want to check out our beef or our flour, we have a website, murphygenerationsfarm.com. You can check that out and you can look us up. We're on Facebook, Instagram. I'm on X, and you can look us up. And I'm trying to put out a lot of videos and stuff on there so you can follow everything we're doing.
Highly recommend that to all the listeners. It's been great following you. So thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.